The air in our kitchen always smelled like a mix of industrial-strength laundry detergent and the faint, lingering ghost of wood smoke. It was a scent that used to mean safety to me, the smell of my hero coming home. But that morning, as I stood by the laminate countertop, the smell made my stomach churn with a cold, acidic dread. My father, Captain Robert Miller of Station 42, sat at the head of the heavy oak table, his large, calloused hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. He wasn't wearing his turnout gear, just a navy blue station shirt that strained against his shoulders, but he looked as formidable as if he were standing in the middle of a 4-alarm fire. "Today's the day, Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. He didn't look up at me. He was staring at a spot on the wall just above my head, his jaw set in that granite line that usually meant he was about to give an order that couldn't be questioned. 18 years and 1 week. I told you when you graduated high school that the clock was ticking. I've done my job. I fed you, clothed you, and given you a roof. I felt the blood drain from my face, a prickly sensation spreading across my scalp. I had thought he was joking, or if not joking, at least exaggerating for effect. My mother was standing by the sink, her back turned to us, her shoulders hunched up to her ears. She was scrubbing a pot that was already clean, the rhythmic screech of the scouring pad the only other sound in the room. "Dad, I'm still looking for a job," I said, my voice cracking in a way that made me hate myself. I tried to study it, to sound like the man he wanted me to be. The economy is tough right now, and without a degree or a trade certificate yet. "Excuses don't put out fire, son," he interrupted, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were the color of cold ash, hard and unforgiving. "And they don't pay the mortgage. You've spent the last 3 months sleeping until noon and playing those damn video games. You're soft. You've had it too easy because your mother and I shielded you, but the world isn't going to shield you." I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "You're just throwing me out? Where am I supposed to go?" He stood up then, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the linoleum floor. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a single key, and set it on the table with a sharp clack. "That's the key to the front door.
I'll be taking it back before I head to the station for my shift at noon. Your bags are already in the hallway. I packed the essentials." I looked at my mother. "Mom?" She finally turned around, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She looked older than she had just yesterday, the lines around her mouth etched deep with a grief she couldn't voice. "Your father thinks it's for the best, Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling. He thinks you need to learn how to stand on your own feet." "It's not love," I spat, the fear finally giving way to a white-hot spark of anger. "It's an eviction." My father let out a short, dry laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. "A stranger would have paid rent. You've just been a passenger. Go on then, get your stuff. I'll give you a month. 1 month of sleeping in your car or on some friend's floor, eating ramen and realizing that the world doesn't owe you a damn thing." The arrogance in his voice was the final straw. It wasn't just that he was kicking me out, it was that he was so certain of my failure. He had already written the script for my life. I would stumble, I would starve, and I would crawl back to him, broken and subservient, ready to be molded into the mini version of him that he always wanted. "I won't be back," I said, the words feeling heavy and permanent in my mouth. "A month, Leo," he repeated, checking his watch. "You have 2 hours to get your car loaded." I walked out of the kitchen, the sound of my sneakers squeaking on the floor feeling deafeningly loud. In the hallway, 2 large duffel bags and an old cardboard box sat by the door. I recognized the bags. They were the ones he used for his extra gear. He hadn't even let me pack my own things. He had curated my departure. I dragged the bags out to my beat-up 2005 Honda Civic. The humid morning air felt like a physical weight on my skin. I could hear a neighbor's lawnmower buzzing in the distance, a mundane, suburban sound that felt absurdly out of place given that my entire world was collapsing. I shoved the bags into the trunk, my movements jerky and frantic. I went back for the box, which contained a few of my books, my laptop, and a framed photo of me and my grandfather, the only man in the family who had ever told me it was okay to be a dreamer. As I walked back toward the house for the last time, I saw my father standing on the porch.
He was leaning against the railing, his arms crossed over his chest, watching me with the clinical detachment of a commanding officer observing a drill. My mother was nowhere to be seen. I suspected she was hiding in the bathroom so she wouldn't have to watch me drive away. "You forgot this," he said, holding up my spare key. I walked up the steps, my knees shaking. I took the key from his hand, our fingers brushing for a split second. His skin was rough and hot. I didn't say thank you. I turned to walk away, but his voice stopped me. "Don't call your mother crying when you run out of gas money," he said. "I've told her not to answer. This is on you now. Prove me wrong or come home ready to work." I didn't look back. I got into the driver's seat, the interior of the car smelling like stale French fries and old upholstery. I started the engine, the familiar rattle of the muffler sounding like a death knell. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw him in the rearview mirror. He didn't wave, he didn't flinch. He just stood there, a pillar of unyielding duty and tough love, watching his only son disappear around the corner. I drove aimlessly for the first hour, the tears finally blurring my vision so much that I had to pull over into a deserted church parking lot. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, a sob tearing its way out of my throat. The silence in the car was absolute, a suffocating vacuum that highlighted exactly how alone I was. I looked at the $300 in my bank app on my phone. It looked like a joke. A month's worth of groceries, a week's worth of gas and cheap motels. I thought about my friends, but most of them had already headed off to college or were working summer jobs while living at home. I couldn't bear the thought of showing up on their doorsteps like a stray dog, explaining that my hero father had tossed me out like garbage. The shame was a thick, bitter coating in the back of my throat. I looked at the cardboard box in the passenger seat. My laptop was in there. He wanted me to use my back. I wanted to use my mind. 1 month, I whispered to the empty car, my voice trembling but hardening. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, the grief transitioning into a cold, sharp clarity. He hadn't just kicked me out. He had issued a challenge. He had bet against me. He had bet that I was weak, that I was nothing with his shadow to hide in. I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the road. I didn't have a destination yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I would sleep in this car until the tires rotted off before I ever set foot in that house again. I would starve until my ribs poked through my skin before I asked him for a single cent. He wanted to see what the real world looked like? Fine, I would show him, but I would also show him what happens when you push someone too far. I headed toward the city, the skyline shimmering in the distance under a haze of heat and smog. It looked daunting, a concrete labyrinth that didn't care if I lived or died. But as I watched my childhood neighborhood disappear in the mirrors, replaced by the gray asphalt of the interstate, I felt a strange, terrifying flicker of freedom. The safety net was gone, just like he said, but the cage was gone too. I reached over and turned on the radio, flipping through the stations until I found something loud, something with a heavy beat that drowned out the sound of my own thoughts. I wasn't going back in a month. I wasn't going back in a year. As I drove, I began to map out the next 24 hours. Step 1, find a place to park where the cops wouldn't move me along. Step 2, find a library with free Wi-Fi. Step 3, find a way to turn that $300 into $3,000. The journey had begun, not with a celebratory graduation, but with a betrayal that felt like a physical wound. My father thought he was teaching me a lesson about survival. He didn't realize he was actually teaching me how to live without him, and that was a lesson I intended to learn perfectly. The steering wheel felt like a lead weight in my hands, vibrating with a rhythmic, bone-deep shudder that told me the alignment was shot. Every time I hit a pothole on the crumbling outskirts of the city, the car groaned, a metallic shriek that echoed my own internal state. The air conditioning had died somewhere around mile 50, leaving me to bake in the stagnant, humid air of the cabin. Sweat slicked my palms, making it hard to grip the plastic rim of the wheel, and the smell of hot asphalt and old upholstery filled my lungs until I felt like I was breathing in the history of my own failure. I looked at the fuel gauge, a thin white needle hovering precariously close to the red line. It was a ticking clock, a countdown to the moment I would be truly stranded. I pulled into the parking lot of a massive 24-hour grocery store on the edge of the industrial district. It was the kind of place where the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, and the pavement was stained with unidentifiable fluids. I parked as far from the entrance as possible, tucked between a rusted-out delivery van and a dumpster that smelled of rotting produce and bleach. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I turned the engine off, and the silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy, pregnant with the reality of my situation. I reached for my backpack in the passenger seat, my fingers brushing against the worn fabric. Inside was everything I owned: 3 changes of clothes, a laptop with a cracked screen, a half-empty bottle of water, and $300 in crumpled 20s. I pulled the cash out, smoothing the bills against my thigh. $300. In this city, that was a joke. It was a week of cheap motels, or a month of ramen and prayer. My father's face flashed in my mind, that smug, calculated expression he wore when he told me I wouldn't last a week. I could almost hear his voice, smooth and condescending, whispering that I should just turn around now and save us both the embarrassment. "Screw you," I whispered to the empty car. My voice sounded thin and cracked. I took a deep breath, trying to settle the nausea rolling in my stomach. I needed to move. Standing still was how you got caught. Standing still was how you gave up. I stepped out of the car, and the heat hit me like a physical blow. The city didn't have the cooling breeze of the suburbs. It was a heat sink, radiating warmth from every brick and slab of concrete. I locked the door, as if there was anything left to steal, and began the mile-long trek toward the public library I'd seen on the GPS before my phone battery hit 5%. My shoes, thin-soled and worn, felt every pebble and crack in the sidewalk. The library was a brutalist slab of gray concrete, but to me, it looked like a cathedral. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the burst of air-conditioned oxygen made me dizzy. I stood in the lobby for a moment, just breathing, letting the sweat dry on my skin. The smell was familiar: old paper, floor wax, and the faint ozone scent of 100 humming computers.
I found a terminal in the back corner, tucked away from the main circulation desk, where a tired-looking librarian was stamping books with mechanical precision. I sat down, my joints popping, and felt the hard plastic of the chair support my weight. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Step 2, find a way to make that money grow. I bypassed the social media icons and went straight to the classifieds, the gig economy boards, and the under-the-table listings that most people ignored. "Just looking for work." The voice made me jump. I turned to see a man sitting at the terminal next to me. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a beard that looked like it had been trimmed with a belt pocket knife, and eyes that were far too sharp for a man wearing a tattered army jacket in mid-July. "Just looking for work," I said, my voice guarded. I turned back to the screen, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me. "Work is a strong word for what you'll find on that site," he said, leaning back. "Most of those quick cash jobs end with you losing a kidney or getting a ride in the back of a squad car. You look like you're from the burbs." I stiffened, my fingers clenching into fists. "I'm doing fine." He chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "Not a lecture, kid, just an observation. Name's Elias. I've been sitting in this exact chair every day for 3 years. I know the look." I didn't answer. I couldn't. He was too close to the truth, and the vulnerability felt like a raw nerve being touched. "If you want real money," Elias continued, ignoring my silence, "you don't look at the help wanted section. Go to the high-end neighborhoods, the ones where the grass is too green and the fences are too high. They don't want employees, they want ghosts. People to haul away the junk they're too embarrassed to put on the curb. People to scrub the stains they don't want the neighbors to see." I looked at him then, really looked at him. "Because," he said, standing up and grabbing a tattered canvas bag, "I like the way you haven't cried yet. Most of the kids who come in here are sobbing by the second hour. You look like you're ready to burn the world down. I appreciate that kind of energy." He walked away before I could respond, his boots scuffing against the linoleum. I watched him go, then turned back to the screen. Hours bled into one another. I searched, I messaged, I mapped out routes. My stomach began to ache, a sharp twisting pain that reminded me I hadn't eaten since the previous night. I ignored it. Hunger was just another sensation, like the heat or the hum of the computers. I found 3 potential leads: an estate cleanout in a wealthy zip code, a late-night warehouse shift that paid in cash at the end of the night, and a guy looking for someone to help move heavy equipment at a construction site starting at 4 a.m. I wrote the addresses down on a scrap of paper I found in the trash. As the library lights flickered, signaling closing time,
I felt a grim sense of purpose. I walked back to my car, the city now bathed in the orange glow of sodium vapor streetlights. The air was slightly cooler, but thicker with the smell of exhaust and grease. I climbed back into the driver's seat and looked at the dashboard. My phone was dead. I didn't have a charger that worked with the car's cigarette lighter. I was flying blind now, relying on the map I'd memorized and the scrap of paper in my hand. I drove toward the warehouse district, the car's headlights cutting weak yellow paths through the darkness. This was the first test. If I could get through tonight, if I could turn a few hours of back-breaking labor into $50 or $60, I would survive. The warehouse was a cavernous structure of corrugated metal, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with coils of razor wire. A group of men stood near a loading dock, their silhouettes sharp against the interior floodlights. I pulled up, my engine rattling one last time before I cut the ignition. I stepped out, my heart racing. A man with a clipboard and a neck like a bull looked up. "I am," I said, stepping into the light. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my clean clothes and my trembling hands. "It's 12 hours of hauling crates. No breaks except for 10 minutes at midnight. $50 cash at the end. You walk off early, you get nothing. You break something, I break you." "I understand," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Then get inside." I walked toward the loading dock, the heavy scent of diesel and industrial pallets filling my nose. My father thought he was teaching me about survival. As I lifted the first wooden crate, the splinters digging into my palms and the weight pulling at my shoulders, I realized he was wrong. He wasn't teaching me how to live without him. He was teaching me that I was stronger than he ever was, because I was willing to bleed for a future he thought he could take away. The first hour was adrenaline. The second was pain. By the fourth, I was a machine, my body moving on instinct, my mind focused on a single thought: one more crate, one more dollar, one more step away from the life I left behind. Every muscle in my back screamed, and the sweat stung my eyes, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop, because if I stopped, I would hear the silence, and in the silence, I would hear his laugh, and I would rather die on this concrete floor than let him be right. The midnight break came and went like a fever dream, a 10-minute blur of sitting on a cold radiator and drinking lukewarm water that tasted of rust. When the foreman barked for us to get back to work, my legs nearly gave out, but I forced them to lock. I returned to the rhythm, the mechanical repetition of lift, pivot, and stack. My fingernails were torn, and the salt from my sweat burned into the fresh cuts on my palms, but the physical agony was a shield. It blocked out the memories of my father's sneer and the way he used to tell me I was made of glass. Every crate was a piece of the wall I was building between his world and mine. By the 10th hour, the warehouse grew quiet, the only sounds being the heavy thrum of the ventilation fans and the rhythmic thud of wood hitting wood. My vision began to tunnel, focusing only on the next pallet. I wasn't thinking about the money anymore. I was thinking about the fact that I was still standing. I was thinking about how many times he had told me I would crawl back to him the moment things got difficult. Yet here I was, my lungs burning with diesel fumes and my spine screaming, and I hadn't uttered a single word of complaint. I was outlasting the doubt he had spent 20 years planting in my mind. When the sun finally began to bleed through the high, grime-streaked windows of the dock, the foreman blew a shark whistle. I dropped the last crate, a heavy, iron-bound box that felt like it weighed a ton, and let my arms hang limp at my sides. My hands were shaking so violently I had to ball them into fists. The foreman walked over, his boots crunching on the grit of the concrete floor. He looked at the mountain of crates I had moved, then looked at me. For the first time, the mockery was gone from his eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a wad of crumpled bills, and counted out $50. He slapped the cash into my palm, the paper damp with my own sweat. "You're tougher than you look, kid," he grunted, already turning away to check the next manifest. I didn't thank him. I just gripped the money tight, the edges of the bills digging into my raw skin. I walked out of the loading dock and into the crisp morning air, the light of a new day stinging my tired eyes. My body was broken, my clothes were ruined, and I had never felt more powerful. I possessed $50, and a soul that no longer belonged to my father. I started walking down the cracked sidewalk, not toward the home I used to know, but toward the horizon, finally realizing that the real world wasn't a threat. It was an invitation.